Morning, and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin, here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is resilience and the remarkable capacity we have to come back from tragedy and loss and pain. And we're going to look at how that happens and maybe how we can mobilize that in our lives to thrive. So it's kind of a brilliant mechanism that we engage in, and it's over time. We can look at what causes pain and how we can relieve it. So before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. Let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale, exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light, lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, and energizing all your cells, all your molecules, your electrons, and creating a brilliant beam of light and energy from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's press our palms together, vigorously rub your hands together to feel the friction, the temperature, the pressure, the motion, the tickling and tingling as you stop. And allow all those sensations to bring you present right here, right now, into this remarkable physical form that enables you and us to experience life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, resilience. It's it's extraordinary. And good morning, Roslyn. Welcome. So good to have you here with us this morning. We're talking about resilience, and it's absolutely remarkable to me to see how people come through the tragedies and the pain and the losses that we come through. And we tend to be able to carry these devastating circumstances, or we survive these things, we live beyond these things and somehow manage to function, which it's kind of remarkable when you think about it. And what do we do that enables us to continue on after such devastation? And in looking at it, we can see that there's that we say time heals all wounds. I don't know that it's true, but at least it covers them over most often. Uh, and what happens is through time, through practice, through distance, we become less overwhelmed by the circumstances or the impact of the circumstances. And oftentimes, what happens is if we don't address those things, they just go deeper. They just end up embedding themselves more deeply in our body and being somehow to be triggered at later dates in many ways. Or they show up in behavioral shifts that then persist. It's not that these things necessarily go away on their own. It's not that they're necessarily healed, but what happens is that we have distance, and when we experience loss, when we first experience loss, we're pretty admired in the stories about that loss that we tell ourselves, like, I'll never see that person again, or this is un you know unreconcilable, or we tell ourselves stories of shame, or we tell ourselves, or people around us have stories about what the incident was. And what happens is, over time, we get disenchanted with those stories. Often, not always. Sometimes we carry on those stories for extended periods of time with great gusto and verve. And that's where the suffering comes in too, is by reinforcing those stories of pain and loss and guilt and shame. But what happens over time most often is that we achieve some distance from those stories. And as we achieve distance, it becomes a dimmer memory, and the voices quiet themselves. And I'm using these explanations in a very deliberate way because we can use these mechanisms to affect the way that we interact with our stories, our recollection of events. We can, I remember saying to somebody at one point, well, that's your story. And they got really offended that I was somehow minimizing their experience, when in fact that's not the case at all. We all have stories and we all operate through stories. We just don't recognize them as such. We think it's just is, that our stories are what's so, that's the truth, rather than our perspective or our interpretation of things. And it doesn't minimize the impact of those stories on our lives and those we share them with, to say that they're stories. But what happens with loss and tragedy is that it's very vivid. We tend to have, well, we have different ways that we prioritize, or our integration of information. So some people are more visually oriented. Some people are more auditorily oriented. What they're hearing is their primary way of processing. Some people are more kinesthetic. It's what they feel. It's physical. And then there are other modalities too, and blends of these different modalities in terms of what takes priority for each of us as individuals. But when we experience something very vividly or very profoundly, we're stimulated in that primary sense. So with tragedy, we might be replaying a visual image or a visual scenario that is, if we're visually oriented particularly, that is very, very disturbing. So an example was, I know someone who cut themselves. They cut themselves pretty badly, and they ended up having some, what they were calling PTSD about the experience. And in talking with them, I asked, well, what is happening to recreate the trauma around it, the upset around it? And they said, well, I just keep seeing all this blood and, this gushing blood. And so looking more closely, again, visual words here, at what it was they were seeing, it was vivid red blood. And by shifting the visual representation, by making that whole image black and white rather than in vivid color, what happened was the emotion reduced, the reaction pretty much reduced and disappeared, because the visual stimulation that they were recreating over and over was became a whole lot less compelling and terrifying. So for those of us who are visual, what happens is that our memories fade. When we talk about memories fading, we're talking about losing color, maybe having greater distance from that experience. These are submodalities in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. By shifting submodalities, we can shift our experience of something. So when we want to emphasize something, if we can brighten the colors, if we can bring it closer, oftentimes that makes the experience more vivid. And so when we're experiencing pain, we can do just the opposite. We can mute the colors. We can make the image fuzzy. We can send it to a greater distance. And for those of us who are auditory, what's happening is that we keep replaying the same tape or the same words or the same sounds over and over. And the likelihood is that they're very loud and that they may be in surround sound. And we can lessen the impact of those words, those sounds, that audio experience by turning down the volume, by making it a directional sound, by taking it further away, by playing another sound in our mind in addition to it. So if there are really damaging words, for instance, that keep replaying, you can change the quality of the voice that's speaking those words, or you could put a music track underneath that is funny, or you could speed it up, or you could slow it down, all kinds of things that you can do with an audio track. And all of these submodalities, all of these adjustments make an impact on how that stimulus is received emotionally. The emotional impact of it shifts. And so when we feel things, we're often feeling something like it hit me in the gut, right? It knocked the wind out of me. So what we can do is to presence ourselves to those feelings. And if it's something like it knocked the wind out of me, we can relax into taking a deep breath, for example. We can look at what it would take to loosen up our shoulders, to release the tension. And the fact that we have the power to do this, it happens naturally, I think, most of the time it happens naturally over time. So we can accelerate that process by implementing these techniques. And on the flip side, we can use the techniques to enhance a state that's desired. When we want to feel something more vividly, more keenly, if we're visual, maybe we can make it closer, we can make it bigger. To minimize it, we make it smaller, shrink it, blur it, send it a further distance. Add in fog or something too. So what's happening is that we're working with our perception, which dictates our emotion also. We're altering the story, so to speak, by shifting the perception. So there's this loop of perception, interpretation, meaning. It kind of goes around and around, and each element can affect the others in this loop. So you can enter at any place in the loop to intervene. We can shift the meaning, which shifts the experience, which shifts the perception. We can shift the perception, which shifts the experience, which shifts the meaning. And you get the idea that there are all different points of intervention. Now, this doesn't necessarily, the meaning is one of the way, well, meaning and emotion and intensity, all of those things are what imprint an experience for us. And we can shift the response to that experience. One of the most powerful ways, and we talk about this a lot, to shift the impact of an experience is to shift the meaning or the story that we have behind it. But it's interesting to notice that these things all intertwine and impact each other. And so our resilience is due to, in large part, our incapacity to hold intensity for prolonged periods of time. But we can re-trigger that experience pretty readily, through the images that we create in our mind, the stories or the words that we speak or the sounds that we hear or the feelings we feel. We can reactivate those experiences. And until we intervene with them, they can lie dormant. But what happens is, because we have a limited attention span, eventually the pain dissipates. And it might be partly because we just get tired. And some of us are more persistent than others. Some of us are more committed and have a greater tolerance. So we continue in the experience of that pain, playing it over and over and over. But it's not a dynamic that is external. It's not something that we don't have the ability to affect, because we can. And it's not a denial of reality to interact with the circumstance in that way, because the reality is malleable, the reality is subjective, and we're creating it over and over again. We just don't even realize that we're doing that. So Rosalind says, when working with someone and they bring up trauma that happened to their physical bodies while doing a guided meditation, what's the process look like if helping them to process those memories associated with a broken bone, even though it's not broken anymore? So I'm not sure what happened. Maybe what you're saying is that the trauma that happened to their physical body comes up during a guided meditation or during a process. What would it look like to help them with the memories? So the likelihood is that it's not the sensation of the bone breaking that they're remembering. They're probably seeing and hearing and feeling the surrounding circumstance. So if there's trauma around a broken bone, the question is, well, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What are you feeling? To find out where there's a place that there's a possible intervention. So they might be seeing, like, I got an image of a broken bone with the bone protruding through the skin. And so if that's the image, they can do a number. If it's a visual thing that they're remembering, they can do a number of things. They can bleed it of the color. Sorry for the trauma reference there, but they can take the color out. They can make it look like a cartoon instead of a hyper realistic photo, for example. They can maybe send the image further away. They could maybe blur it. And the thing to do is to ask, well, what happens if you take the color out of the image? Does it still have that emotional impact? What happens if you turn it into a cartoon? What happens if you add a soundtrack that's a funny soundtrack? What happens if you make it further away, or if you make it a fuzzier image? What do you feel? What if anything changes about the way you feel in response to that image? What happens? Oftentimes we tell ourselves stories about things that are really helping to perpetuate the pain. And so finding out what the stories are is important. And oftentimes we'll hear a voice in our head saying this, that, or the other thing. And then we can identify that voice. We can change the volume. We could maybe change it to a different voice. We could add a soundtrack. We could speed it up. We could slow it down. We could make it a instead of surround sound, we could make it coming from one place. There are a number, we could add static. There are a number of things that we can do. And the question is, or the question to ask the person is, how does that shift? If it does, how does it shift your feeling about the trauma? So with this person who had cut themselves, just having the image be black and white instead of vivid color made all the difference. It was just like that. I said, can you turn it black and white? And they said, yeah. I said, how is it now? Fine. That was all it took. So it's surprising and kind of miraculous that that's all it takes. But our mind doesn't make a distinction between what's real and vividly imagined. And just that fact alone should give us an understanding of how malleable our reality is. So we can be vividly imagining something just sitting here. I've had it happen with clients. That had a client who was wearing one of those bio rings, kind of, that gives all kinds of feedback on physiological process. And just sitting there, we were sitting in the same situation within the space of 10 minutes. They were relaxed and at ease. And then they started talking about something else. Their blood pressure went sky high. And then we started talking about it, a different perspective, and their blood pressure went down. So we create these realities for ourselves. They had experienced something internally so vividly that it impacted their physiology in a really dramatic way. So when we have trauma, this is just a really, really effective way to kind of denature it, is by looking at how are we representing that experience? How are we replaying it? And then once you recognize how it's being replayed, you can intervene with that replay as an editor, as an author of your own story kind of thing, and create a shift. So I hope that's helpful. It's powerful, powerful tools that can assist us in our resilience. So that's it for this morning. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live here each weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page and YouTube channel. And I invite you to like, follow, and share Enlightened World Network and me. The links are in the description. And as always, hey, Debbie, so lovely for you to chime in. Welcome. You're so welcome. As always, it's a deep and wonderful privilege and pleasure to be able to spend this time with our morning musings on being human, this amazing experience that we're all having. So until next time, so much love to you.